Thank you everybody for being here today. Thank you especially for Bill Fallon and for Alex Nathan for inviting me to spend this semester here at Cornell. So as you can see, I'm not 100% fluent in English, so if you have any doubts or if you want me to clarify, make it more specific, a point that perhaps is not that clear, when I first said, just let me know, raise your hands, and I can try to make it clearer. We'll be talking about the ethnography, the anthropological research I've been conducting in the Tapajós River. It's a region in the Brazilian Amazon. It's the Pará state. And I would first like to start with this image because I think it synthesizes a lot of what I'm going to be talking about. I think this image actually talks much more than I would be able to explain about what's currently going on in this part of the Brazilian Amazon. On the left side, it's a national forest. It's called Flona, Tapajós Flona, named after the river. And on the right side, it has not very specific protection, law protection against deforestation, and it's a soy camp. It's a soy field. And this road that you can see right in the middle here is the BR 163, which happens to be a very important road for the logistic of soy exports towards the European Union and China, mainland China. And sorry, just to complement, it connects the state of Mato Grosso, which is a major soy producer, to the Tapajós River, and then it goes to the Atlantic and gets shipped to the European Union and China. So I have structured this presentation in 3 parts. The first one is more a context of the Tapajós River and this multi-ethnic territory composed by traditional indigenous communities and also riverside communities named Ribeirinhos and Caboclo population, like Mestiço population from this part of Brazil. And on the second part, I will talk a little bit more about what it means to do an ethnography of deforestation in the Amazon forest, or the ideas I've been working to this ethnography of deforestation. And on the third part, which is like the heart of my presentation, it will be about the construction of toxic landscapes and the use of pesticides, a political technology to create these void spaces over which soy can develop. And a term that I've been trying to work with, it's expulsion by asphyxiation, the way the traditional communities are forced to move from their territories and go to peripheral neighborhoods in the city of Santarém mainly. So like just to give a map, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Brazilian Amazon. Yeah, you are? Okay, good. So this is like the whole Amazonian region. It covers 9 countries in South America. And the Tapajós, which you can see right here, is highlighted, is a major tributary of the Amazon River. It's in this part of Pará, the western side of Pará, which is a state that has been records on deforestations year after years inside Brazil. And there are 13 indigenous, so I'm working in the lower Tapajós River. Usually we divide it in upper Tapajós River, middle, and lower Tapajós River. So there are some specificities according to the region, but mainly on the lower Tapajós River, which is there that I'm working, there are 13 different indigenous groups, dozens of quilombos, which are Black communities with a background of anti-racist struggle, and thousands of riverside traditional peasant communities, the ones we call Ribeirinhos or Caboclos. Just an aerial image of how the Tapajós looks like in a very preserved part of the Tapajós, which is completely different from the picture that I've just shown. So I think that it's fair to say that life at the banks of the Tapajós River hasn't been easy in the last years, the last decade, for the communities who has a strong relation, a mutual constitutional relation with the land, their territories. Among the threats, there is a construction of about 43 hydroelectric plants, damming not just the Tapajós itself, but its main tributaries. Illegal mining activities, mining companies that are making requirements to start prospecting different kinds of minerals, including gold, inside indigenous territories, which creates widespread mercury contamination, logging, and now that we're going to focus more, I'm going to focus more on this presentation. It's about the intensification of the soil being monoculture at the banks of the Tapajós River. Usually, I was working with Cacique Braz, Cacique's chief, the indigenous chief of this Tupinambá group. And at first, when we were doing the self-demarcation of the with the self-demarcation, to create a kind of trail, like to cut small trees down, and then make it able for them to do a surveillance of their own territory and understand if there are loggers acting inside and they find traces of people living in the territories. So I followed them around 12 days inside the forest. It was a very intense experience, as you may imagine. And at a certain point, in the middle of our walk, Cacique Braz told me, "So Fabio, can you imagine all of this turning into a soil field?" And he was very worried when he said that, and he kept on talking about the soil fields. And I'll just explain why in a moment. Just another image. He's another chief. There are around 16 different Tupinambá villas, and it's an interesting process because more traditional riverside villas are becoming Tupinambá communities. There is this fluidity of identity, political and ethnic identity. That's a very interesting process in the region. So that's how it looked like for the the ethnography that I've been developing in the Amazon in this part of the Tapajós River is divided into three parts. The first one is this politics identity that struggles against around what it means to be indigenous in the region, mainly because the agribusiness people who are mainly working in Santarém, they call them fake Indians in a very pejorative way. They try to deny their identity. So in the first part of my research, I've been investigating how do they conceive their own identity over the passage of time and how they conceive being indigenous in the 21st century in this specific region. The second part of this ethnography is based on their conceptions of how colonization has been weakening their bodies, the fact that they are living less than they used to live, according to the ancient myths. And it's a very ethnological part of the research. It's mainly focused on the myths of the origin of the manioc, with the cassava manioc, this root, which is a major food for them. And they call it like the destruction of their territory comes along with a lack of real food. And they start consuming more food, processed food coming from the sea. So it kind of like process the destruction of their territories. And the third part, which is the focus of this presentation, is how it's focused on landscapes, on how the space is created to the advancement of soil in the region. And she's a very also quite important leader. It's interesting to have woman leaderships in the region. That was not that common 10 years ago, 15 years ago, but now indigenous women have also a more protagonistic role inside their own communities and the struggle against the major threats they're facing, especially agribusiness. And so I just wanted to show you this map. It's not a very good one. The colors are not the best, but it's the one that I found. So here's the city of Santarém, red points. And all of this is where the soy has been implemented in the last years. The forest was turned down, and the soy fields developed mainly in that region. And the Tupinambá, here it doesn't look like a long way, but it's almost 12 hours by boat to get across the Tapajós and you get into the stream. It's where their villages are mainly located. And they look, there's a kind of a mirror game because they look at the right banks of the Tapajós, and what they see is the forest is gone and they only see soy fields. So somehow they are, when they look at the other side of the river, it makes them very worried about the future of their own territories, and they started this self-demarcation process that I'm mentioning here. Is it more or less clear, the context? I don't know if you want to make comments or questions. Oops.
The arrow.
Yeah. That's how the landscape of the right banks of the Tapajós looks like. It's completely different from the left side. So I'd like to do like a zoom in on what this deforestation process looks like and how to do a topological research on this. And I would start with a reflection of what does the neoliberalization of the Amazon forest looks like. You can see the silos that the soy grains are contained before being exported to the European Union and China mainly. And I think it's important to reflect on this concept, neoliberalization of nature, neoliberalization of the forest, because it's through this expansion of another political technology for managing territories and creating these white spaces that allow soil to expand and insert every single inch of this territory into a global chain of production and products. So from the river, from the bottom of the rivers, the Ghana model, to the construction of a hydroway to have bigger ships exporting soy, to the international market of carbon credits that's also inserting the forest into a chain production of value. I think the main challenge here is that an ethnography of the expansion of neoliberal capitalism in the lower Tapajós reflects on the political techniques by which neoliberalism is produced in friction. What I'm trying to say is that I don't see any reason for taking neoliberalism as an already hypothesized thing being applied into different parts of the world, but how it is produced in tension, in friction, in very particular territories. So instead of analyzing how neoliberalism has been expanding to the forest, what I'm trying to do is understand how these conflicts create the expansion of neoliberalism, which means like not taking neoliberalism for granted, but understanding its own production for these conflicts in the Tapajós region. I don't know if I made myself clear, but we can keep on with the discussion. Unfortunately, I just found data from 2018. This is a very good platform for tracing sensitive supply chains, but I don't know why they haven't updated since 2018. But it gives an idea of those are the main cities in the lower Tapajós region, Santarém and Belterra. A lot of this goes to domestic consumption, but Cargill, which is an American company that happens to be the biggest private company in the world, is responsible for 100% of the soy produced in the municipality of Santarém. And it goes mainly to European Union and China. Here are just a few figures of the amount being produced in tons. I'd also like this quote by Jason Moore because I think he's going to be giving a talk tomorrow together with Wendy. So I don't want to stay reflecting on this quote, but I think it's interesting to take that into consideration because it allows us to understand capitalism itself as an ecological regime. So the toxicity of these landscapes and people being forced to move away from their land These are not externalities, these are not consequences of capitalism, unwanted consequences of capitalism, but the way capitalism works through nature-society relations. So that's an image of trucks that transport soy into this main highway that I mentioned, BR-163, on a petrol station. And the pavimentation of this highway is also playing a major role in increasing the logistic capacities of the region. And so getting more into the heart of the presentation, I think I've been trying to follow traces left by this deforestation process in order to describe it, in order to describe how deforestation is working. And I selected two traces to follow. So I call this an evidential-based ethnography because I'm following the creation of these void spaces. And the way I understand anthropology is very influenced by Brazilian scholars such as Eduardo de Castro. Many of you may have already heard about him. And it's an understanding of anthropology as an ethnographic theory. So through a critical theory that emerges from an in-depth description of a certain context, of a certain situation. And there is a person that I've been interviewing and talking to for years, Mr. Manuel is his name. He's called Senhor Macaxeira, so people always call him by his nickname. And so he always mentioned the farce. I like to read one of the dialogues we had in the car. We're driving around, and he said, "Oh, the farce of the communities," he exclaimed from the back seat of the car. And I asked him, "What do you mean, Mr. Manuel?" And he said, "There are only a few houses here and there on the side of the road, and nothing else. Here before it was all a community." And a few kilometers ahead, he resumed his reasoning. The farce they left behind, and he continued, pointing to the narrow strips of remaining forest surrounded by soy fields. Just a few trees here and there, he concluded. Behind it, that's all soy. So, which means that this image is like we were driving the road, and from the road you can actually see a few trees, you can see strips of forest, you can see small houses, but they are just a farce, he's claiming. They're just what's left from these big communities and this big forest that used to exist there until not a long time ago. And I've just selected this image. It's a drone image that I've made with a photographer from the school, completely surrounded by soy fields, and it gives this dimension of what he's meaning by farce. So if you look at it there, you can see some strips of forest that are still existing, but behind it, it's all soy fields. This image is also very clear. It's just the opposite side of the school, and what happens is that the children, they go running after. Sure. Yeah. Sorry. This is the school. This is the soy field behind the school. Here is where they plant, like they have small plantations with their students, which has all the glyphosate that comes from the soy fields. Glyphosate is the mainly pesticide being used in the region. I think
it's called Roundup.
The commercial name of it is Roundup, and it's forbidden in many countries. It's getting, more forbidden also in Germany. It was produced by Bayer, if I'm not mistaken, Monsanto. Monsanto Bayer. Yeah.
Weed killer?
Weed killer, yeah.
Weed killer.
So that they don't have to cultivate.
And so we were able to get this very moment where the tractor was applying the pesticide, and all the children were running, trying to get closer because it's a fascinating thing, a huge red tractor for a group of children. So I'll talk a little bit more about pesticides in a moment. I just wanted to mention the second trace that I've been following to understand how to describe this deforestation process, which is virus, and especially hantaviruses. This was not in my original plan when I started doing the research, but it became more evident after the pandemic hit. And after some readings and understanding and interviewing epidemiologists specialized in the Amazon region, it became clear that this region along the PR 163, the main road that is used for soy exports from the trucks I show you, it's one of the main clusters of hantaviruses in Brazil. And it happens that the rodents that transmit hantaviruses, they find out deforestation creates a better atmosphere, a better ecological system for them to reproduce and get together. So it intensifies contact with human, and hence the transmission is increased. So there was a survey done in this region, in specific municipalities, and around 12% of the population had already antibodies against hantaviruses. And of course, it can be local epidemics, but it can also, depending on which virus surge, as we all have been living the last 2 years, it can also become a pandemic. So I think there's a multi-species aspect of this research in understanding, and this might look like a contradiction, but the soy monoculture fields as a place where multi-species relations also happen. So there's this relation between soy, rodents, glyphosate plantation farmers, international corporations such as Cargill financial systems, because those farmers are all supported by big financial institutions such as the Citibank. There are a lot of reports about it and other banks in the world, and the hantaviruses themselves. Just a few books that have been influencing my work here: The Government of the Beans, and Rob Wallace, and he's the author of Big Farm Makes Big Flu. But this is a collection of essays he wrote about the relation of climate change, agriculture practices, and the emergence of viruses. I didn't find a book like this in English. I think they just got a bunch of articles together translated to Portuguese. So in this multi-species ethnography that I'm doing, between people, plants, and poison, I think two questions that will guide this last section of my presentation is: what does the construction of the soil space looks like in the Amazon forest, and how is glyphosate being used as a political technology in the shaping of these farcical landscapes by either specific forms of life, but more than specific forms of life, I think I'll rephrase it as specific webs of life, including this multi-ethnic territory composed by indigenous communities and riverside communities. Is it clear? Like, you can understand me? I think I'm having a hard time to explain myself sometimes. Okay, so so in this last part of the presentation, which is the heart of what I want to present to you, I want to reflect on how does the composition of these toxic landscapes actually happens on the ground. And Alex Day, which is my supervisor here, he wrote this very inspirational article on anthropological works about toxicity, and I think it has been a major influence in my research. That's the reason I'm here now as well. And what I think is interesting to mention is these both aspects that are highlighted: the fact that pesticide toxicity, contamination by toxins, and in this case, pesticides contaminations are very elusive. It's pretty hard to scientifically prove, or at least it defies the challenge, the factual, to say that some kind of disease or some health problems were caused by the pesticides themselves. And the other aspect, I think it's important to highlight, is like this, that toxicity, in this case, like the pesticides being used, they overlap, they are bounded with specific patterns of harm and white supremacy, colonialism, and economic exploitation, and in this region also at racism against this population, environmental racism. So I'd like to start with this region. It's called this community, specific community. It's named Boa Esperança, which means good hope. And I think the name itself is very important because all they feel is like they had a bad past, and this idea of a good hope when the community was created and at the turn of the 20th century didn't sustain over time. So they were major producers of manioc, and manioc is the main carbohydrate. It's like manioc flour is the main source of calories in the regional diet, together with, if you're in a traditional community, it's mainly fishing, manioc, and game meat that people eat. And this region was like, they used to produce a lot of the manioc that was sold in the city of Santarém. So it was a huge thing in the city. And I went to the house of Seu Curica, Mr. Curica, and his daughter, Sonia Maria Guimarães. He himself has a very hard time planting inside his garden because of the soil fields that surround his property, and he cannot grow. And so there's this phrase of him: the seeds, it blooms, but it doesn't grow. So it was pointing to a cashew tree when he first phrased this for me. And his daughter, Sonia Maria Guimarães, has a lot of anxiety issues when their neighbors start spraying the pesticides. She locks herself in her room and she can't breathe, she chokes, she has a very hard time when they start spraying, and they spray at any time. There's not, they try to talk to the farmers if they could spray like in a moment where they're not at home, but they said, no, we can't predict, it's just the way the plantation grows and we're going to spray whenever we want. So I think we can have a dimension of the ecological disturbance that she describes, like the macaws and the monkeys that used to come to her yard for berries. They suddenly disappeared at a certain point in the last years. And also a very sad story for them is their the mother, the former wife of Mr. Curica, and the mother of Sonia, who died because of cancer, stomach cancer. And she was part of the local union, the union that the traditional peasants built in order to fight against the expansion of the soil monoculture fields. And they really got emotional when they talk about her. She's remembered as a person who fought a lot in order to avoid such an expansion of the soil monoculture and to stop the use of pesticides, but she didn't succeed. So they really have this feeling of kind of a melancholy of what the community could have been and what it is now. And that's their house. So I think it gives a perfect image of what they are passing through. You can see the variety of species that they grow inside their own walls, but it's all surrounded by soil monoculture fields. And on the other side too. And I think that now we're getting to an important part of the presentations, because the pesticides, they force people, the farmers use the pesticide, they force people to sell their houses for whatever price, whatever money is offered to them. So they no longer have the conditions to plant. They just accept any kind of payment that the farmers offered them, and they go to the peripheral neighborhoods of Santarém. I think I jumped one image actually. Oh no, I didn't put here, but I'm sorry, but the cemetery where she's buried is also surrounded by soil. It's a very impressive image. I forgot to put it. And just to show a little bit of figures for you, here we have the area of soybean that has been expanded. So IBGE is the main government statistic producer in Brazil, and they have this program that follows every single crop in every municipality. So we can see that the soybean, the planted area of soybean in the 8 hectares almost doubled from 2004 to 2020. Whereas the manioc area went from 10,000 hectares to less than 5,000, so it was reduced by 50%. And here's the other city that I'm working in, Belterra, and the increase is even higher. So it's from 5,000 hectares of soybean being planted to more than 22,000. And I didn't put on the slides, but roughly 10% of the forest has been deforested, put down since 1985. And when you go around the region, if you drive around and you go to the communities, you can still find those small houses where people used to live and were bought by basically very low price. And they are about to be torn down in order to create a flat space for the soil. So about this term, toxic wording, it's interesting to reflect on how soil pesticides and farmers only exist in the lower Tapajós region in relation. And when I say that, I'm trying to say that they do not only destroy words, but they are also creating words. And they become what they are together, articulating violent scenarios, creating a world ruled by poison, used in a process of expulsion by asphyxiation. There is the work of this Italian botanist, I don't know if you've heard about him, Stefano Mancuso, and he makes an interesting reflection of humans and grains as in a symbiotic relation. So he says a history of co-evolution, specific grains providing with the food humans need, and in change, they obtain a super-efficient vector capable of allowing them to spread into different continents. So they have colonized, and he mentioned specifically 3 grains, wheat, corn, and rice, that provide about 60% of the calories consumed by humanity, but currently consumed by humanity. And in turn, they have colonized huge areas of all countries, surpassing any plant competitor in terms of dissemination of land. So just 2 quotes, like the territory and balancing, I think they're useful to think about what will come into next, which is reflecting on this process of expulsion by asphyxiation. And some multi-specific relations are privileged, while others are eliminated, and it's pretty clear that those species who can become assets, who can be in this process of ecological simplification that pesticides provide, and the plantation skills of beings that are not recognized as assets. So what I think is also interesting to understand, like white here, is that those there's a kind of a dialectic in the traces that I've been following, because those are not only secant territories, like territories that are sick, but there are also territories that are producing new diseases. So I think to sum up this part of the presentation, this is something I've been exploring in my research. And when I mention expulsion by asphyxiation, first of all, I'm not talking about a metaphor. And I think that's really important because it's asphyxiation in this very concrete sense that people cannot breathe. And I just show you a family, but I've been interviewing many other peasants who has the same reports on how it's impossible for them and for the children. The children suffer much more than the adults in this kind of situation, and it's mainly impossible for them to breathe. And I would say it's also impossible for the plants, for certain plants to breathe as well. So it's not a metaphor, first of all. And I think by expulsion, by asphyxiation, I'm trying to refer to the most death is produced in these frontiers of the neoliberalism, of the expansion of neoliberalism over the Amazon forest. And a reflection that I've been also debating with Alex, a point we've been debating since arrival is what's the role of anthropology in investigating the constitution of these toxic landscapes, and I think it allows to think about this collective illness caused by the besieging monocultures, and not only individuals that can be diagnosed with specific disease. Another important aspect of this process is that the monoculture calls for more poison. So all the farmers that grow around the soy camps, they can no longer not use pesticides. They are obliged to start using pesticides because otherwise all the pests go inside their own traditional farms. So they can no longer produce organic. Otherwise the plants just don't grow. And I like a lot this text. I don't know if some of you have read about Achille Mbembe, the Cameroonese philosopher. He wrote during the very first semester of the pandemic. I don't remember the name of the text in English, but I think it is the universal right of breathing, le droit universel de la respiration in French. And he calls attention to the fact that modernity has been an eternal war on life, and in specific forms of life, as we've been seeing here. And just this more theoretical reflection, Craig Hitterton has been talking a lot about agro biopolitics in a twist, in a comment of the Foucauldian reflection of biopolitics and the phytosanitarian measures taken by states in order to protect their own plantations and food security. But I also think it's important to reflect on this other aspect, which is perhaps an agro-necropolitics, that we can see this killing related to the expansion of the plantations in the Amazon. And Michelle Murphy, who will be here tomorrow also in the seminar in the anthropology department, talks about settler colonial capitalism as expressed through chemical relations. And I think this is important because it also helps to insert this specific context in a history of killing and emptying of the Amazon. So then I come again to this relation with the viruses. And from the 50s, from the 1950s on, this is a pretty impressive story that was made public when the archives of the Brazilian military dictatorship were opened. And researchers started investigating what happened. We had a truth commission that also brought a lot of these stories. So from the 50s on, colonizers, together with the convenience of the federal government, started throwing clothes from their airplanes to with contaminated viruses like flu virus, measles, and smallpox into indigenous communities in order to clean the area. So I think we can understand this use of pesticide as another chapter in the history of cleaning the region, the concretization of this imaginary of an empty Amazon, which has played a major role in the history of Brazil, this idea that the Amazon is a big demographic void, but how this void is being produced, I think, is the question that I've been following through this research. And especially, I think it's important to mention the word the Cinta Larga indigenous groups, the border of the Mato Grosso and Rondônia, were killed by this throwing of contaminated, infected clothes from the airplanes. And the part I'm now working on the dissertation is about the infrastructures of this region, how they're being implemented and constructed. So ports, railroads, waterways, and the paving of this major highway, which is BR 163. And then it comes into another interesting aspect, which is like the ecology created by this infrastructure, as the infrastructure allows more deforestation. It helps delivering the grains, so it creates an economic environment where you can have more grains being produced, so it incentivizes the deforestation of the region, and hence it favors the emergence of new diseases. It comes again to the question of the antiviruses in the region. And perhaps we can call this a chemical vegetal global infrastructure, in the way that to see soil as a global infrastructure enhanced by poison. And this is a topic I'm still working on, so that was it. Thank you. And